Years of military service had taught Ethan that plans rarely survived first contact. But this was different. The mission had seemed straightforward. Fly into enemy territory, extract the high-value alien rebel leader, and get out. Simple, right? Ethan had done it 100 times before. But the enemy had been waiting and their ship had been hit hard. Now it was a miracle they were even alive. The moment the alarms blared, Ethan knew they were in trouble. The cockpit shook violently as their transport ship plummeted through the atmosphere of the unknown planet. Flames licked the edges of the viewports, and the controls sparked in his hands. The ship wasn't just going down, it was crashing. "Brace for impact," Ethan shouted, though the words barely left his mouth before the world around him exploded in sound and light. The ship hit the surface with bone-rattling force. The metal screamed as it tore apart, and Ethan's body was thrown violently against the harness. Black spots danced in his vision as the impact jarred every bone in his body. He fought to stay conscious, the noise of the crash deafening, the heat from the fires licking at his skin. When the ship finally skidded to a halt, everything went silent. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the faint hum of broken electronics. Ethan's vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus. He was still alive. Through the haze of smoke, he saw bodies, his team, the men and women who had been with him on this mission. None of them were moving. Forcing his aching muscles to respond, Ethan unclipped his harness and stumbled out of his seat. The cabin was a wreck, twisted metal and shattered glass everywhere. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. Come on," he muttered to himself, limping through the wreckage. His head pounded, and every step sent a wave of pain through his body, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Then he saw her. Lyra, the alien rebel leader he had been sent to rescue, lay pinned under a piece of debris near the back of the ship. Her dark, luminous skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and her long silver hair was matted with dust and blood. She was still breathing, but barely. Ethan rushed over, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he heaved the metal off her. She let out a groan, her body stiff as she tried to sit up. "Don't move too fast," Ethan said, his voice rough from the smoke. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they locked onto his. Even in the chaos, there was something captivating about her gaze, something fierce. You came for me," she whispered, her voice weak. Ethan nodded, helping her to her feet. "Yeah, I did, but we need to get out of here before the enemy finds us." Lyra winced, clearly in pain, but she didn't argue. They both knew they were on borrowed time. The planet was hostile, and if the crash didn't kill them, whatever lived out there might. As they staggered out of the wreckage, the landscape around them came into focus. Jagged rock formations stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky above a deep, swirling purple, dust storms whipped across the horizon, and the air was thick with tension. "This isn't just any planet," Lyra muttered, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "It's one of theirs. We're in enemy territory." Ethan's stomach sank. This was supposed to be a simple extraction. Get in, get out. But now they were stranded in the heart of enemy territory with no way off the planet. "We need to find shelter," Ethan said, his mind racing, "and fast." Lyra nodded, though she was clearly struggling to stay on her feet. "We can't stay out in the open. They'll come for us." Ethan glanced back at the burning wreckage of the ship. The smoke would be visible for miles. They were sitting ducks if they stayed. "Come on," he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the jagged cliffs in the distance. "We'll figure this out." As they moved through the rocky terrain, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were alone, cut off from any support, and stranded on an alien world crawling with enemies. But Ethan had survived worse, and he wasn't about to give up now. The mission wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time in his career, Ethan wasn't sure if they were going to make it out alive. The barren landscape stretched out endlessly before them, a wasteland of jagged rocks and swirling dust. The alien sky, tinged with deep purples and reds, hung overhead like a storm waiting to break. Ethan's body ached with every step, but he kept moving, pushing himself forward through the desolation. He had no choice. They couldn't stop, not here. Beside him, Lyra limped, her expression set in grim determination. She was trying to hide it, but Ethan could see the strain in her movements. The crash had taken its toll on her, and she was struggling to keep pace. Still, she hadn't complained once. "We need to find water," Ethan said, breaking the silence as he scanned the horizon. His voice sounded rough, the dry air making his throat raw. "And shelter. We won't last long out here without either." Lyra nodded, though her eyes remained focused ahead. "There's a cave system near the cliffs," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "If we can make it there, we'll be safe from the elements for the night." Ethan frowned. "And the enemy?" Lyra's gaze hardened. "They'll come. It's only a matter of time." Ethan cursed under his breath. Of course, they'd come. The enemy wasn't known for leaving loose ends. The fact that they'd been shot down in the first place meant someone knew they were here, and that someone wouldn't rest until they were dead or worse. The two of them continued in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the distant howl of the wind. The terrain was unforgiving, with sharp rocks jutting out like teeth from the ground. Every few steps, Ethan had to catch himself as the uneven ground threatened to trip him up. "How far are these caves?" he asked, glancing at Lyra. Her face was pale, her breath coming in short bursts. She wasn't doing well. "Not far," she replied, but there was a tremor in her voice. She was barely holding on. Ethan cursed again, this time under his breath. They weren't going to make it at this pace. Not unless they found some way to push through. His military training kicked in, and he stopped, grabbing her arm gently. "Lyra, listen," he said, his tone firm but not harsh. "We need to rest. You're not going to make it like this, and if you collapse out here, we're both dead." Lyra's eyes flashed with defiance, but he could see the exhaustion beneath it. She was a fighter, but even fighters had limits. "We can't afford to stop," she protested, but there was no strength behind her words. Ethan shook his head. "We don't have a choice. We'll find some cover, catch our breath, and then move." Just for a few minutes, Lyra hesitated, her pride clearly warring with her body's needs. But finally, she gave a small nod, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Ethan scanned the area and spotted a small outcropping of rocks not too far ahead. It wasn't much, but it would give them some cover from the wind and the open terrain. He motioned toward it. "Over there." Together, they made their way to the rocks, and Ethan helped Lyra sit down, her back against the rough stone. She winced as she settled in, her body clearly protesting even the small movement. Ethan crouched beside her, taking a moment to catch his breath as well. His own body screamed in protest from the crash, but he'd been through worse. Pain was something he could deal with. Lyra's breathing was labored, and Ethan could see the sweat beading on her forehead. She was tougher than most people he'd met, but she wasn't invincible. No one was. After a few moments of silence, Lyra finally spoke. "You're different from the others." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The others?" "The soldiers they send," Lyra clarified, her voice soft. "You're not like them." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or something else. "I'm just doing my job," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Lyra shook her head slightly, her eyes closing for a moment as she leaned back against the rock. "It's more than that. You didn't have to help me. You could have left me there." Ethan frowned. "I was sent here to get you out. I don't leave people behind." Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile. A soldier with principles. Rare these days. Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't. Instead, he focused on the horizon, his eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of movement. The enemy was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. He could feel it in his gut. After a few minutes, Lyra opened her eyes again, her strength seemingly returning. "We should go." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure if she was really ready. But she was right. They couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. The enemy would catch up eventually, and when they did, they needed to be ready. They moved out again, this time at a slightly faster pace. The wind had picked up, kicking dust into their eyes and making it harder to see. Ethan squinted against the gusts, his hand on his sidearm, ready for anything. Then he saw it. A shadow moved in the distance, quick, almost imperceptible. But there, his heart leapt into his throat. "Lyra, we've got company." Lyra stopped, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gaze. How many? Can't tell, Ethan muttered. But they're close. Lyra cursed under her breath. We're not going to outrun them. Ethan knew she was right. They were exhausted, and the enemy was fresh, hunting them like prey, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. There's still time to make it to those caves, he said, his voice filled with determination. If we can get there before they catch up, we'll have the high ground. Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. Let's move, Lyra said, her voice steady. With that, they broke into a run, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. The caves were close, so close they could almost taste it. But the enemy was closing in, and the race for survival had truly begun. The hunt was on. The caves were in sight, dark openings in the cliff face looming just ahead. But Ethan and Lyra weren't alone. Behind them, the shadows moved with purpose, closing in with terrifying speed. The faint hum of engines and the unmistakable whir of mechanized drones echoed through the barren landscape. They're faster than I thought, Lyra muttered through gritted teeth, her pace quickening despite the pain in her legs. Ethan scanned the area, his pulse quickening. The enemy wasn't just fast, they were coordinated. The small dots on the horizon had multiplied, and now there were at least half a dozen enemy drones, likely scouting ahead for the larger forces. He could make out their sleek, insect-like forms darting between the jagged rocks, and the low rumble of a larger ship hovered in the distance, no doubt carrying ground troops. We're almost there, Ethan said, his voice tense. Just keep moving. The wind whipped against them, sending dust and grit into their eyes. But the caves were close now, a safe haven at least for the moment. They just had to make it inside. Ethan could feel his legs burning from the effort. The crash had done more damage than he initially realized, and every step sent a jolt of pain through his body. But he kept going. They had to. Lyra stumbled but caught herself quickly. Her breathing labored. They'll have ground troops. They won't send just drones. Ethan knew she was right. The drones were scouting, tracking them, keeping their position locked. The real threat would follow soon, the bounty hunters themselves. And if they didn't make it to the caves in time, they wouldn't stand a chance. Once we're inside, Ethan said, we'll find a defensible position. Those caves will give us cover. Lyra nodded, though she looked far from reassured. Let's just hope it's enough. They reached the mouth of the cave just as the first drone broke the ridge behind them, its red optics gleaming in the fading light. Ethan fired off a quick shot, the plasma bolt striking the drone's sensor and sending it spiraling out of control. It crashed into the ground with a satisfying thud. Inside. Now, Ethan barked, waving Lyra toward the entrance. They scrambled into the cave, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the blistering wind outside. Ethan quickly scanned the area. It was deeper than he'd expected, a network of tunnels winding into the rock. That was good. It would give them more options if they needed to fall back. The cave walls were jagged, dripping with condensation from some unseen underground source. The faint sound of water echoed through the space, a quiet but constant trickle. It felt like a sanctuary, at least for now. They'll be here soon, Lyra said, her voice steady but low. She was leaning against the wall, catching her breath, but her eyes were fixed on the cave entrance. Ethan nodded, moving toward the entrance and peering out. The drones were still out there, their metallic bodies skittering across the rocks as they searched for the two fugitives. He could see the larger bounty hunter ship in the distance, hovering just out of range. It was only a matter of time before they sent in the ground forces. We have the high ground, Ethan said, more to himself than to Lyra. He was trying to formulate a plan, to figure out how they could hold off the inevitable assault. But the reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. They were outnumbered and outgunned. And this wasn't just about survival. Lyra was a high-value target. They would send everything they had to capture her. Ethan turned to face her. How many hunters are we dealing with? Lyra's eyes darkened. It could be anywhere from a small squad to an entire battalion. It depends on how much they value me. Ethan let out a slow breath. Great. They won't stop until I'm dead or in chains, Lyra added, her voice cold but resigned. I've been hunted before. I know how they operate. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a fight for survival. And there was no backup coming. It was just the two of them. He checked his weapon, making sure it was fully charged. The drones were still moving outside, but the larger ship had moved closer now. It hovered just beyond the ridgeline, no doubt preparing to drop the ground forces. They're coming, Ethan said quietly, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Lyra stepped up beside him, her own weapon in hand. Then we make our stand here. Ethan couldn't help but glance at her. Despite everything, despite the danger they were in, there was a calm strength in her that he hadn't seen before. She wasn't afraid, not of the bounty hunters, not of the overwhelming odds. She was determined. For a moment, their eyes met, and Ethan felt something stir within him, something unexpected. They had only known each other for a short time, but already, he felt a bond forming, a bond forged in the heat of battle, in the desperation of survival. He didn't know what to make of it, but now wasn't the time to dwell on it. Outside, the drones were converging on the cave entrance. The bounty hunter ship hovered ominously above, and Ethan could hear the unmistakable sound of landing gear deploying. They're about to hit us hard, Ethan said, bracing himself. Get ready. Lyra's grip tightened on her weapon. I've been ready for this my whole life. Ethan positioned himself behind a large boulder near the entrance, using it for cover as he aimed his weapon at the opening. Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes focused and sharp. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cave as the first bounty hunter stepped inside, his black armor gleaming in the dim light. He was followed by two more, their weapons raised as they moved cautiously forward. Ethan waited, his finger hovering over the trigger. Timing was everything. The bounty hunters advanced slowly, their eyes scanning the cave. They were professional, disciplined. They knew what they were doing. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They had one shot to make this count. Now, he shouted. Lyra fired first, her shot hitting the lead bounty hunter square in the chest. He staggered back, but before he could recover, Ethan's shot took him down. The other two bounty hunters reacted instantly, opening fire, but Ethan and Lyra were already moving, ducking behind the rocks as plasma bolts ricocheted off the cave walls. The fight was on. Ethan fired again, hitting one of the bounty hunters in the leg. He went down with a grunt, but the last one was still standing, his weapon blazing as he advanced on their position. We're pinned, Lyra shouted, ducking as a plasma bolt seared the air above her head. Ethan gritted his teeth. They couldn't stay here. They had to move. Cover me, he said, and before Lyra could respond, he broke from cover, charging toward the bounty hunter. The hunter fired, but Ethan was faster. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, slamming into the bounty hunter with all his strength. They hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the weapon from the hunter's grip. Ethan didn't give him a chance to recover. With a swift punch, he knocked the hunter unconscious. Breathing hard, Ethan stood up, glancing around the cave. The drones were still outside, but for the moment, they had cleared the immediate threat. Nice work, Lyra said, her voice breathless but steady. Ethan nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. We're not done yet. The drones will be in here soon. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. Then let's finish this. Together, they prepared for the next wave. The cave had grown eerily quiet after the firefight. The bodies of the downed bounty hunters lay motionless, their black armor reflecting the dim light from the cave's entrance. Outside, the sound of approaching drones grew louder, unrelenting, mechanical whirs cutting through the stillness like a countdown to their next battle. Ethan knew it was only a matter of minutes before the drones swarmed the cave, followed by the next wave of hunters. Ethan stood over one of the fallen bounty hunters, grabbing his weapon. It was an energy rifle, more powerful than the sidearm he'd been carrying. We'll need all the firepower we can get, he said, passing one of the other weapons to Lyra. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal as she checked its charge. They won't stop until we're either captured or dead, she muttered, her voice low and even. Ethan glanced at her. He knew she wasn't exaggerating. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. This was survival. We make this our last stand, he said, moving toward the cave entrance to get a clearer view of the advancing threat. The sky outside was darkening as the planet's two suns dipped lower on the horizon, casting the landscape in eerie red light. The silhouette of the bounty hunter ship loomed in the distance, like a vulture circling its prey. I've been fighting my whole life, Lyra said quietly, stepping up beside him. But I've never had someone fight with me. Ethan met her eyes, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to settle between them. They were outnumbered, stranded, and fighting against impossible odds. But they weren't alone. They had each other now, and that had to be enough. Neither have I, Ethan admitted. He had always fought for his comrades, for the mission, for the greater good. But this was different. It felt more personal. The sound of the drones drew closer, and Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle. Get ready. The first drone appeared at the cave's entrance, its sleek form hovering just above the ground. It scanned the area with its red optics, sweeping the cave with a cold, calculating precision. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired, the energy bolt hitting the drone's sensor dead on. It exploded in a shower of sparks, its mechanical parts scattering across the ground. More followed. 2, then 3 drones darted into the cave, their movements swift and coordinated. Ethan and Lyra fired in unison, their shots precise, taking out the drones one by one. But they kept coming. It was relentless. "We're going to be overrun," Lyra shouted over the noise. Her voice tense but steady. She ducked behind a boulder as another drone's energy blast narrowly missed her. Ethan knew she was right. The drones were just the beginning. The real threat was still out there, the bounty hunters, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to fall back," Ethan called, motioning toward the deeper tunnels of the cave. "If we stay here, they'll surround us." Lyra nodded, her eyes sharp with determination. Together, they moved further into the cave, using the narrow passageways to their advantage. The deeper they went, the more the walls closed in around them, forcing the drones to funnel through one at a time. It gave them a fighting chance. They found a narrow chamber deeper inside, the ceiling low and the walls lined with jagged rock formations. It wasn't much, but it would give them cover. Ethan took position behind one of the larger rocks, his rifle at the ready. Lyra crouched beside him, her weapon trained on the entrance. The drones buzzed outside, their movements methodical, but the narrow passage slowed their advance. They came through one by one, and Ethan and Lyra picked them off as they entered, the confined space turning the fight into a battle of attrition. For what felt like hours, they fought, their bodies exhausted, their muscles aching with every shot. But eventually, the sound of the drones began to fade, and the silence returned. Ethan's chest heaved as he lowered his rifle, sweat dripping down his face. His arms felt like lead, and every breath was a struggle. But they were alive. Lyra wiped the dust and sweat from her brow, her glowing eyes dimming slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. "We did it." Ethan leaned back against the rock, closing his eyes for a brief moment. They had survived the drones, but he knew it wasn't over. The real challenge was still out there. Just as the thought crossed his mind, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the cave. Bounty hunters, moving with a cold, calculated precision. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. "Get ready," he said, pulling himself to his feet. Lyra nodded, though her expression was grim. They were out of options, out of time, and nearly out of energy. The first hunter appeared at the entrance, his black armor gleaming in the dim light. He was larger than the others, more heavily armored, and he moved with the confidence of someone who knew he was in control. Ethan fired, but the hunter deflected the shot with ease, the energy bolt glancing off his armor. The hunter raised his weapon, aiming directly at Lyra. "Now!" Ethan shouted, diving toward the hunter with all the strength he had left. He slammed into him, knocking the weapon from his hands and sending them both crashing to the ground. The hunter was strong, but Ethan was faster. He grabbed the hunter's helmet and slammed it against the rocky floor, again and again, until the body beneath him went limp, panting. Ethan rolled off the hunter and grabbed the fallen weapon. He turned to see Lyra standing over the other 2 hunters, their bodies slumped against the wall. It was over. For a long moment, Neither of them spoke. The cave was quiet.
Save for the sound of their labored breathing.
The bounty hunters were dead, and the drones had been destroyed. They had won, but at what cost? Ethan dropped the weapon, his hands shaking from exhaustion. Lyra stepped forward, her expression unreadable as she crouched beside him. "We're still alive," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up at her, his chest still heaving. "Barely." Lyra smiled, though it was a small, tired smile. "That's enough for me." For the first time since the crash, Ethan felt the weight of everything lift just slightly. They were still stranded, still alone on an alien world. But they had survived. They had fought together, against impossible odds, and they had won. As the dust settled, Ethan reached out, his hand finding Lyra's. She looked down at their hands, her expression softening. "We'll figure this out," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We've made it this far. We'll find a way off this planet." Lyra squeezed his hand gently, her eyes meeting his. "I believe you." And for the first time, Ethan believed it too. Together, they had a chance, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side.